friends. Welcome back to the Wall Street Skinny. I'm Jen.
I'm Kristen.
And we are two lifelong friends, former investment bankers, and teachers here to give you the skinny on how to land and thrive in the world's highest paying jobs. Before we get into the episode today, one of the things that we really haven't touched on in a lot of ways is the question of being an underrepresented minority on Wall Street. And we get asked all the time, both politely and not. Sometimes people will ask us, can you speak to the experience of women of color in the industry? And we're like, no, we can't, right? Because we are extremely white and we come from a very privileged background. And we are not the right people to be speaking to that experience. And then we also get questions that are not phrased so constructively on our videos. So when we shared feedback to one of those questions saying, hey, listen, we're not the right people to be sharing that perspective, we actually got someone who reached out and was like, you have got to talk to my fiance, this incredible woman who has risen to the senior ranks within Bain Capital, which is one of the world's biggest private equity funds. And so sure enough, we connected with this woman and she's absolutely incredible. And we're so excited to share her story. And also one of the things about today's podcast is it's not just about that perspective, although I'm really excited for Florence to tell her story and share her insights. But this is an episode that explains so much about opportunities within the private equity sphere that I did not fully comprehend. I feel like when we've talked about private equity, it has always been, whether it's through the perspective of a megafund or a lower middle markets firm, it's always been with an eye towards the deal-making team, towards valuations of companies, when to buy them, when to sell them. We've never really talked about the meat and potatoes in between, although we did get into that a little bit with your friend AJ Tracy, who is working for a lower middle market private equity firm. And if you haven't listened to that episode, I actually think that's a great episode to layer on top of this one to hear the similarities and the differences between his and Florence's professional experience. But so we're going to talk about operations within a private equity firm today, which means something very different from other types of operations that we talk about within the world of high finance.
Well, it's funny because I think people oftentimes hear the word operations and it's one of those things that they're not interested in. But from this perspective, like this is the meat and potatoes of if you are buying a company, at the end of the day, this is the most important part. And so the people that tend to go into the roles that Florence is in tend to be former consultants and people who have experience, or former CEOs, people who have the operational experience of like getting in and doing the hard work and actually creating the value. Like this is the most important thing that private equity firms do. So I think that when you hear the word operations, it can mean different things to different people. Again, from the trading perspective, it's very much more of like a back office role. In this perspective, like this is the entire value creation. This is the most important thing. And as we're going to get into, we also were going to talk about, because you mentioned AJ's episode. And again, I 100% agree. I think that that should be anyone interested in private equity, that is our 101. But because he's at a lower middle market firm, he's doing a lot of the operational work. So even though he sort of has the deal team and investment banking experience and going and actually buying these companies, he's doing that operational work. And so when you have these mega funds and these much larger private equity firms, they have entire departments or what have you that are devoted to going in and doing a lot of those operational changes. So, you know, we get into so much in this episode. It's, I think, just so enlightening for people who might have a slight understanding, but not really understand private equity.
The me's of the world.
Yeah, because we get into, again, the differences between like a mega fund, lower middle market. We get into some of the things that people don't necessarily think about. This conversation was just so much fun, so fascinating, so educational. And I'm like so excited that we're airing this today.
And for anyone who is interested in a role in private equity, but is like, hey, I missed the boat on the whole, you got to be on the investment banking track and need to know about this basically your freshman or sophomore year in college. We've had a lot of conversations and we've been like, yeah, I mean, you can try, like there's a chance, but whatever. I wasn't fully aware that there's this entire other segment of the industry that isn't looking for investment bankers. They are looking for a totally different skill set. So you will understand that after today. And for those of you who are like, I feel like I'm too old, or I feel like I don't have the right resume or whatever, this is the episode for you if you want to break into private equity.
Yeah.
So today we are joined by Florence Ivina Zay. And Florence, thank you so much for being here today. I'd love it if you could share a little bit of your background and how you got started in the finance industry.
Yeah, so I thank you for having me today. It's really great to meet you both. My background into private equity is a little bit unusual. So I studied mechanical and material sciences and engineering in college. I went to Harvard University for college and then kind of graduated, realized I didn't want to necessarily work as an engineer. I went to consult at Deloitte Consulting in New York City in 2008, which was an interesting time to start your career. A lot of my financial services clients in that first year were going through a rough time, as was everyone. But it was really kind of a trial by fire and learning about the business world without having taken any business classes in school. I worked at Deloitte for 3 years and then went to Harvard Business School to kind of round out my business education, had a wonderful experience there, and decided actually to stay in consulting and really where I'd focused on more financial services clients, telecom clients in the past. I actually switched to do more work in industrials and consumer at McKinsey, and I was based in Miami, Florida for 3 years there. And then I kind of got this bug to go into the beauty industry and wound up at Ipsy, leading customer care there for 4 years.
What is Ipsy? That's a new name to me.
Yeah. So Ipsy, it's the leading and largest beauty subscription company. So at the time that I was there, they were shipping about 3 million glam bags. They're like these little makeup bags with 5 sample size products every month. And then while I was there, we grew extremely fast, acquired BoxyCharm, and now we're shipping full size products. We have e-commerce. So it was a really wonderful experience. And being in the kind of Bay Area ecosystem was really exciting, and just learning about more of like the startup world. But while I was there, I got a call from Bain Capital, and I picked up immediately. And they told me about this opportunity to work in their portfolio group, which is a small group of professionals who really focus on helping our executives at our companies drive their value creation story. So when our deal team kind of goes through the work to purchase a company, our team comes in and then helps them through the life of the investment to really grow and be just a really great partner to them.
Awesome. I actually want to do one quick thing for our listeners. So I feel like they likely know the name Bain. People talk about MBB, which is like the McKinsey, Bain, Boston Consulting Group. Stereotypically, that's kind of what people think of when you say Bain. Now, the reality is they have Bain Capital, which is a very well-established private equity firm that does investments. I think, wasn't that what Mitt Romney was part of?
Correct. Mitt Romney was the founder. Wait, this is a dumb question on my part. Are the two related, or they just have the same name?
No, they're related.
They were kind of, so Mitt Romney and a couple other partners at Bain and Co. Left Bain and Co. in 1984. Actually, this is their 40th anniversary year to found Bain Capital because they had this idea that they could do value creation with companies and invest money on behalf of our investors. And so they formed that idea 40 years ago, and now the company has grown into one of the largest private equity firms in the world with many different asset types and investment
But they don't
strategies.
share. Do they share? They're not part of the same company.
We're completely separate now.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to clarify. Yeah, I was like, that's news to me that they're like part of the same
I had
thing.
always heard. And this is obviously I'm glad we're clearing this up. Like I'd always heard people talk about, wanting to go work for Bain, the consulting firm, to make it easier to like go to Bain Private Equity, Bain Capital. But it sounds like they're two separate things. Or is it easier because there's so much overlap and like relationships between
that would make more
executives?
sense.
Okay. Yeah, got it.
There's Bain and Co. has a really strong private equity group, which focuses on a lot of diligences, and we actually recruit quite heavily out of Bain and Co. So that's probably the connection you're making.
And yeah, you'd want to recruit from the firm that was the seed of the idea in the first place. You'd obviously look favorably upon them relative to all else being equal.
We have a great
McKinsey.
relationship. Like we love McKinsey too.
Right.
Clearly, yeah. No, this is so interesting. And really quickly before we get into anything else, I'm also curious because you said you were at McKinsey in the Miami office. I'm just curious because that's another question we get asked all the time. Not just, hey, I want to get into private equity and like I didn't do it right out of school. How can I get in? Which is again, obviously you can speak to that a little bit. But also I'm interested in not living in New York City or not interested in Boston. What was it like being in Miami at McKinsey?
Yeah, it was actually really wonderful. I really miss it. I got there after business school in 2013, and we were just starting this curve of seeing the massive amount of construction and new business into Miami. Like Uber didn't exist in Miami when we moved there, but it came in a year later. And so it was really exciting to be there for that growth. And, 10 years ago, it probably would have been a little bit tougher. There was probably two big private equity firms that I could think of at the time there now, but I know so many, especially post-pandemic, so many companies are moving offices to Miami. So it's a very different landscape. And I think there's probably even more opportunity there than there was before.
Oh, yeah.
So you go from IPSI, you said it was the West Coast, the Bay Area. And then are you now in New York City for Bain Capital? Yes. Okay. So I'm actually curious.
I figured you were in Boston.
Oh, yeah. That's our headquarters.
I'm always just making assumptions. Oh, that's great.
Yeah. So our Bain headquarters are in Boston, and our New York office is relatively small compared to our Boston office. And we have really fluid organization where half our team might be in Boston for the week or vice versa. So it's really nice to be in New York, but still part of the broader Boston office.
Well, that's funny because it's one of those rare companies whose headquarters is in another city, and the satellite office is New York, right? That's also flipping it a little bit on its head, where you're working for a rare Boston-based finance company that actually, like New York, it's like, oh God, those guys. Like,
yeah,
we'll check it on those guys eventually, make sure they're still alive. Oh, that's great. And so what do you actually do within Bain?
Yeah, so for this role in our portfolio group, a lot of the folks on the team have a background in both consulting and then also as operators. So we come from a wide range of industries, and the combination of having that consulting toolkit, like ability to structure a problem, being analytical, working with executives throughout our career, but then also, having had ownership for a piece of a company or a whole, we have former CEOs on our team. So our role is really to combine those skills and work side by side with our management teams at our companies and just help them. We're basically, I'm a generalist, so I can work in any function, any industry, but right now I'm aligned with our industrials practice, which is an awesome group of folks. And I'm currently working with one of our companies and partnered really closely with their CEO, their head of HR, their CIO, head of sales. So whatever they need in order to help drive their value creation story is what I'm there to help them with.
So as the private equity newbie of our pair, I'm going to see if I can translate what you have just said you do,
sure.
How I understand how the industry works, and then you and Kristen can tear me to shreds when I get it wildly wrong. So you have the big bad private equity firm who comes
No, we're great.
All right. Okay, so you have the wonderful, magnanimous, charitable private equity firm that comes in, identifies a target company that they want to acquire. Somebody goes and prices up that deal, bids on that deal, executes the deal. And then you have the next 5, 7, 10 years over the life of the ownership of this asset where you are growing that asset. You need people to actually be helping the people who run this company make this company grow so that you can ultimately then go and exit. So you are closely aligned when you say operations. When we say operations in the investment banking world, that means something totally different than being a company level operator, right? So I want to make that very, very clear.
Yeah.
In the investment banking world, operations means support, right? It means helping facilitate all of the trades, all of the technology, et cetera, for front office who's driving the P&L. This is a totally different, this is operator in the sense of corporate operator, where you are working closely with whether it's the CEO, the CFO, or like all the way down the chain. And let's say it's a steel company or something like that, right? And it's like, okay, how can we make more steel cheaper, better, and outshine all the competition? And you're the one going to the steel plant and saying like, okay, this gear should be switched out or whatever it is. Like what level of granularity is there then when you say operations? Are you looking mostly at the financials? Are you looking at like the nitty gritty of how these people do their business and identifying technology that should change? What does that look like?
Yeah,
Where am I wrong in that whole assessment?
No, I think that was actually like pretty close.
Can I just say one other thing, by the way, for all of our listeners out there who think that the only thing to buy and sell are AI tech companies?
No.
There is a whole world out there. You don't think about this, about how many companies throughout the world are making the world turn by selling fittings on sewer pipes or whatever it is, or under your sink or in your whatever it is. Like it's a huge global world.
Sorry. I want to make one more point, which is that's also the difference between more of the venture capital space and like the private equity traditional buyout. Traditional buyout, their bread and butter is the quote unquote like boring, steady state companies. It is not your sexy tech startups of the world. It is the companies that, to your point, Jen, they are doing the stuff, whether it's like the shipping, whether it's, the manufacturing of those little parts that go on something that's in every manufacturing. Like that's what these firms do. So that's the type of companies that are, again, those like out of investment banking, because I always kind of think in my own little worlds, like out of investment banking, people who were in the industrials group also tend to have great exits because so many firms that are in the industrial space are great leverage buyout candidates.
That's a really good point, and one I haven't heard you make before, Kristen. And I think that's really important because people ask us all the time, industry versus product groups. And it's always like, go for M&A, go for financial sponsors. It's like, or go for industrials because these are the aged companies. And I am curious, Florence, are all the investments that you guys are making that classic buyout model, or is it growth equity and earlier stage investing as well?
Yeah, so in the North America Private Equity Fund, it's that classic buyout, but we have other funds. So we have our Tech Opportunities Fund, which focuses more on like tech companies, sort of mid-size. We have a venture capital fund kind of focused on some AI and all the other, early stage companies. And we have a double impact fund, which focuses on smaller companies that also have a double bottom line. So we have a bunch of different funds.
What's a double bottom line?
Sorry. Well, no, it's great. When you're focused on growing a company's bottom line, like their EBITDA, but
I know there's above and below the line. I know there's that.
The second bottom line is their focus on corporate social responsibility or like doing good in the world. So these are companies in education.
I've never heard that jargon before.
Yeah, I haven't either.
Bottom line is corporate responsibility. Cool. I've learned more in the last 15 minutes, by the way, than I'm dead serious. And I really think that this is one of those things that everyone's so afraid to ask these stupid questions. You'd never know. You'd never know.
Okay, so one other question I have is I also know that there can be such a difference between going to work at like a mega fund versus going to work for whether it's a small lower middle market fund or what have you. And so it sounds like some of the stuff that you're doing is similar to when we talked to one of my former classmates / coworkers, AJ Tracy, he's at like I think what's it called? Like a sponsorless private equity firm or something along those lines. No, not sponsorless. What is it called? Independent sponsor? No, maybe that's what it is. Where he basically, they don't have a fund. They basically go out and do things on a deal by deal basis. Oh. And he actually is currently the CEO of one of their portfolio companies. It's like a manufacturing, like in the packaged goods space. But nice. I guess one of my questions is what you're doing, is it sort of more specialized because you're at a mega fund / is this the type of thing that for someone who went to say like a lower middle market private equity firm, this is what, the quote unquote, like private equity analysts and associates would actually be doing is getting in the weeds and doing some of that operational work because they don't have this other almost like separate division that's focused on that. Like it sounds like kind of what you're doing is what people tend to think of as what they would be doing if they were at some of these smaller firms. Is that the right way to think about this or no?
It could. So I haven't been at a smaller firm, so I can't speak to it, but I would say at Bain Capital, like we grew this portfolio group from a very small number of folks to, a decent amount to be able to support our full portfolio. And each of us has like one or two companies that we support if we're a generalist. And then if we're specialists, then we might support a broader range. I would say it probably is similar to kind of what your friend is talking about. We don't actually go in and take on official roles within the company, but we are partnered so closely. And like to the question earlier around like, am I going to the factory and counting? No, not necessarily, but I'm talking with the team around like, okay, what are our priorities? When we purchased the company, we thought we would grow in these, 3-4 ways. How do we help them do that and do it as fast as possible? So that's more my role. I do get to visit the warehouse. I love that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it's maybe in between what you might be thinking of, Kristen.
Got it.
Okay. 10 more questions. Yeah. We're never going to let you get anywhere. Okay. We're going to keep you here for the next 3 hours. Okay. Actually, I have only 2 questions. So one, talking about the skill set coming into a group like this, you talked about consultants and you talked about operators. Now, obviously, I can totally understand how both of those skill sets align really well with what you're doing. What I didn't hear was former investment bankers, right? Which is the traditional path into private equity that we talk about because we're talking about the people coming in and doing those valuations of the companies to decide whether or not they are a target to buy and ultimately when the time is to exit. So a two-part question first, which is, how often are you communicating with that team, the management team who's tied so closely to the capital and how that capital is deployed? And two, does your background as an engineer at all relate to your ability to be a specialist in the industrials world? Are you like, well, when we're talking about, optimizing this
and material
let
science,
me tell you about Bernoulli's principle or whatever.
No, and material science too. Like
Yeah.
that's,
No, great. So great question. So I think our model at Bain Capital is our portfolio group and our deal team are tied at the hip. Like we go into every investment as partners. We meet as a team every single week, and we both have different things that we'll bring to the table. Traditionally, Bain Capital will recruit probably more heavily from consulting firms, even into the deal team, but we definitely recruit from investment banks as well. And so there's a nice mix of different skill sets that each of us are bringing, and we're both kind of looking at the investment from maybe two complementary lenses. In terms of, does my engineering background help me at all in industrials? I'd like to think so. I think the biggest thing I learned coming out of engineering is like, there's no problem that I can't at least try to solve. It kind of gave me some grit, those late night problem sets and things like that. But I think in industrials, the reason I love industrials, I think it's kind of what you guys were talking about. It's like all these sort of like hidden businesses that like keep this world spinning, keep this country going. And it's always, the people I get to meet in industrials are just the heart of the earth. Like they're just really good people working really hard, and that inspires me. And so I think coming in with an engineering background, yes, I can talk about steel. I can talk about different materials. It's been a while since I got that degree, but it doesn't feel.
Or was your experience at IPSI more relevant, having been within a startup? Was that startup culture more relevant, perhaps?
Maybe in a different way. I think the experience, like working as a leader in a business and not just having if I had only had consulting experience, I might have missed a little bit of like, okay, what does it actually mean to own a department? What does that actually mean to drive results and have to be, accountable for them? And that helps me, I think, when I can put myself in the shoes of our executives who are working hard every single day to drive their results and kind of push their pace. So to me, that, I guess the IPSI sort of more startup experience helps in that regard.
The portfolio group, that's the name of the group you're in, and it sounds like if someone's interested in that versus say going and being on a deal team, is the most common path in to work in consulting, or is there other paths? Can you get and apply directly out of undergrad? So if someone's listening to this and they think this sounds like a better role for me versus the deal team, what are the ways that somebody could go from being an undergrad to being on your team?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So it is actually a longer path. Like at least at Bain Capital, we don't recruit out of undergrad or even really out of business school. It's because you need sort of a longer career where you have had the consulting experience and have had experience as an operator. So it's definitely a longer term path. But I think just continuing to build your experiences in like really meaty roles, like where you have P&L responsibility and where you have to kind of develop your toolkit around influencing and working with different personalities, I think that just takes time, and it's not something you're necessarily going to be able to do, right out of the gates out of school.
Which, by the way, I love that you need to be older and have experience. This is like the most refreshing thing I have heard in a while out of this industry, because normally, literally, like the only criteria is youth. And then it just becomes like, sorry, you weren't 12 when you knew this. And it's like, nope, you actually need the experience. You need to have, whether it's been worked in consulting, worked as an operator, and done all this stuff, because that experience is really helpful. So that's very heartening to hear.
This is the second conversation in the big, sexy private capital world that we've had about roles that do not want the infants. We had the conversation with Carrie Findley, who says, I want you to have underwriting experience, so come from DCM and ECM, and I want you to have, honestly, entrepreneurial experience. She's like, I want you to work at a startup. I want you to understand what these startups are going through, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's interesting now. This is our second conversation. And by the way, the top question we get isn't, what do I do to break into private equity when people are sophomores in college? It's, I'm 30. What do I do? And so often the question is like, too bad, so sad, getting a time machine. But no, that's simply not the case. There are so many different roles, and everyone always assumes the only roles out there are the deal team roles. And it's honestly, we're out here doing God's work, telling everybody about all the roles in private equity that aren't just like the deal team.
It's true though. I mean, in college, all I knew were, doctor, lawyer, engineer. Like there's I didn't even know this career existed when I was in college. Imagine what else will exist down the road. Like, I think it's really exciting to think about.
Yeah.
I love that.
I want to make one really quick point because I do think sometimes this is a concept that is potentially lost on our listeners, but I can't overstate enough how important the operations are in value creation in a buyout. And so Jen and I have talked about how we're like basically in the process of doing this course. And so one of the things that I always like to do is hammer home with just an example of like, if you buy a firm and you pile a lot of debt on it, sure, there's the financial engineering. That's great. Anybody can do it. Where private equity firms really add value is in that improvement of operations, because the operational improvement does two things for the business. Number one, when you think about how you're creating value, you need to grow the cash flows, right? EBITDA is our proxy for operating cash flows. And by the way, when you go to exit your business, the value of the entire firm is a function of EBITDA. So like it's growing your valuation kind of at the top, at the firm level. But the second thing is that, again, those cash flows allow you to pay down debt. So the more you can grow cash flows, the more debt you can pay down. So you're basically growing the value of the business those two ways. And by the way, if you're able to improve the operations of the business, meaning you have better cash flows, you have better margins, you have better growth, now you maybe can even justify a higher multiple. So again, the majority of where the returns come from in a private equity traditional buyout deal is in the operation. This is why those private equity firms tend to love these former consultants who are very sort of analytical in nature and sort of thinking through how to solve problems, is because that value creation is on the backs of the operational performance. Without the operational performance, you're not special. Anyone can buy a company at low, at especially in like the ZERP era, like for low levels of interest on the debt and get a return. But I'm actually curious. I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just like, what was the recruiting process like for you, coming from obviously the almost like conveyor belt out of the banking world, out of actually the consulting world too, because they do tend to have this, again, almost conveyor belt like recruiting process. Sounds like you were called by like, I assume a headhunter, although maybe someone internally at Bain. And I'm just curious what your experience was like recruiting into Bain itself.
And I also want to make the point that I didn't do the math, but like I was like, okay, you were working there for like 3 years, and then the business school, and then the work. Okay, we hear all the time from people who are getting recruited into these mega funds, the night they graduate from undergrad.
Yeah.
And you had already a ton of experience under your belt by the time you got this call. So that also makes you so different from the prescriptive recruiting that Kristen was referencing of like, okay, you're like on the conveyor belt. You got to get in the system really early. You also didn't mention any internships that you did in undergrad or while you were doing your MBA. So I'd love if you could talk about what, if any, internships you did. Again, we're going to keep you here for 2 years.
Yeah,
Seriously, I have so many questions because this for me is the rounding out of the picture, because we are so heavily focused all the time on what everyone seems to want and everyone thinks they want, because that's what's so well publicized. But dude, seems like you're doing pretty well, okay? Like, seems like this is a really great career path, and it doesn't involve getting recruited when you're 12. So like, I want to know what it is.
Yeah, no, and Kristen well said on the description of kind of the differentiator. I think that's something that Bain Capital is super proud of, is our ability to partner with companies and grow them like better companies, better operators over time. That's one of the hallmarks of what we do. So internships. So that's actually one of my favorite topics. I remember I was like a junior in high school and I went to this.
Oh God.
No, I didn't have my first internship then. No, but I was like, I'm mentioning it for a reason. I was doing this research program with a local university, SUNY New Paltz, and a lady came and was like, I'm going to tell you guys one thing, and you guys have to get internships in school. And I was like, I don't know what that word means, but I'm going to write it down. And when I get to college, I'm going to figure out what she meant. And
That's
so,
great.
Yeah, so I wish I knew her name. I would thank her. But when I got to college, my freshman year, went to the Office of Career Services, and I was like, I need an internship. And they were like,
wow.
All right, you got to slow down. But I did. I was actually really lucky to find a program called Inroads, which partners with underrepresented talent to place them in internships starting in freshman year. And so my first internship, I was placed with Chevron, the oil company. They actually had a tiny office in my hometown. I rode my bike to work every day, had that internship for 3 summers. And that actually was like life-changing in the fact that it told me I didn't want to do engineering research.
Yes.
And sorry, really specific. Is
Sure.
Inroads something that is still around? Do you know? I can
I
easily
hope
do
so.
a Google search after this. And was it something that you applied for? Like, did you apply to be accepted into the Inroads program? That was outside of Harvard, I imagine, right?
Yeah. So
yeah.
I hope it's still around. It partners with multiple universities across the country, and they place people not just in engineering internships, like they do place people in finance, accounting.
It looks like it's still alive and well.
Oh, I'm
from a
so
quick
glad.
Google
Yeah,
search.
it was life-changing. So there's other programs. There's like SEO, there's MLT, there's all of these different programs that help underrepresented talent find jobs early on. Bain Capital partners with many of those nonprofits to help place our interns, actually. So yeah, Inroads was an amazing experience. Worked for 3 summers there, and then I took the fall semester off of my senior year, so I wound up having a 4th summer and worked at New Energy Finance, which has since been bought by Bloomberg, and that was kind of my first actual experience in the business world versus a lab. And I love that the founder of that company sponsored internships at Harvard University. And when I met him, he was like, oh yeah, I started my career at Deloitte. And I was like, oh, what's Deloitte? So that was also like how I found, why I even applied to Deloitte in the first place when I came back that fall.
One quick follow-up question. Did you ever go to Deloitte University? I've heard about
Deloitte University.
I
talk about it all the
as
time.
like Disneyland for
Yeah.
consultants. I was like, this is the nerdiest thing, but
So they were building it when I was there, and if I had returned after business school, I would have been able to go, but they were building
Can't win them all.
Yeah, they opened it while I was away.
Oh no!
Okay.
But I've heard amazing things too.
It's so much fun. It's literally Disneyland for nerds. It's
That's
so
awesome.
yeah. Anyway, I'm going to shut up about it because this is not like we are in no way affiliated with Deloitte. I have no if they want to come on down. But no, I mean, it's such a fun place to teach. So, but I'm going to shut up.
Okay, sorry. And now back to your MBA internships.
Yeah, so my MBA internship, so I had a return offer for Deloitte, but I was also just interested in exploring, became really interested in like a chief of staff kind of role. I wanted to see if that would be something, it felt like something I would really enjoy. And I liked the idea of like, oh, I get to work with the C-suite on like the biggest problems, kind of like a consultant, but on the inside. It's a really fun role. So I only applied to, I think, 2 internships. In retrospect, I'm like, maybe I should have cast a wider net, but I wound up working at Raymond James Financial in St. Petersburg, Florida, for their chairman, Tom James, who's an incredible leader. Like, I remember just being fascinated by this company. Like, they continue to grow all the way through the global financial crisis. Their growth was incredible, and he had just such an intense customer focus, and he kind of made all of his decisions with the customer in mind. And he had developed a program called Assistant to the Chairman, and they would take 2 MBA students every summer, have an internship, and then if they wanted to do like a full-time offer. So stepping closer to that career in finance. So now I was working at Raymond James Financial, and it was an awesome experience. Some of the folks who were A2Cs with me, one of them has grown into the company. I want to say he's the CFO, and I want to say maybe even getting promoted further. So it's awesome. An awesome program to really get that access and understand the chief of staff role. So for Bain Capital, it's very memorable. So I had twins in August of 2020. I had my first call with Bain Capital at the end of September with their recruiter. And she's like, do you want to talk to Bain Capital? And I was like, sure. Obviously I do, but I was like very, kind of very early postpartum with my 2 boys.
And with twins, I cannot imagine.
But I definitely wanted to take the call, and then it was definitely the most intense recruiting process I've ever been through. And to your point earlier, it wasn't necessarily like recruiting for McKinsey at Harvard Business School. It's a machine. Like all the people come on one day, you do 4 interviews in a row, boom, you're done. But this was like over the course of basically the fall of 2020.
With twins at home, with newborn twins.
Yeah, with my little baby boys. And lots of support from Dion, my fiance. And so went through many, many rounds of interviews. And I thought it was actually really great because I got to meet so many different folks on the team, whether it was folks who were super senior, folks who had been in my role a couple of years since, met folks from the deal team. And by the end of it, I felt like, okay, I think I know what I'm getting into. Everyone feels really, really great, really humble, really smart. I was just like so excited to learn from the team. And one thing I noticed every time I sent a thank you note, if I had a follow-up question, they would respond like the next day or that same day. Like I was like, oh, I got a really good feeling from everyone.
Also, note to our listeners, the importance of thank you notes. I harp on this all the time. Send a thank you note within 24 hours of every single interview. I don't care if you bombed it. I don't care if it went great. I don't care if they wouldn't give you their email address. You call the FBI and you get it. Like, exactly. It doesn't have to be handwritten, okay? Because by the time it makes it to their office, they're going to think you never wrote them a thank you note because it should be there within 24 hours. So do it via email. Write thank you notes early and often. Yes. Sorry, that's a huge
it's a good
hang up of mine.
Same
in
here.
these interviews, Florence, were you asked to demonstrate technical skill as well as fit, or was your technical skill kind of assumed at that level of seniority?
No, so there were case interviews and behavioral interviews. So each interview was half and half. I guess the case interview was sort of to test the technical. Like, they weren't asking me to model anything the way you would have for like more of a deal kind of role. But I think the case interview helped them understand how I would think about real life problems that each of them had faced with their portfolio companies.
So was it more similar to the consulting type of interview, the stereotypical consulting, like McKinsey interview versus, again, to your point, build an LBO or do a paper LBO on the spot? It was like, how many ping pong balls could you fit? But maybe not a ping pong ball. It's actually like looking at a company, like this company, we're thinking of buying it. And then this is the situation, almost like the Harvard Business Model case study.
Yeah, it was more like your traditional consulting kind of questions, less about like market sizing, more about like, hey, actually this situation happened. It's a pandemic and we had to shut all our stores. What should we do? What should we tell the CEO tomorrow?
And
like,
did you prepare like a mock presentation with data and analysis and do interviews? Okay.
Yeah.
And were you being hired in as a VP or an SVP? I'm curious.
So I was hired in as a VP, although our roles kind of shifted in the last couple of years. So SVP now.
Got it. No, I was just curious because I had a recent consulting interview, recent within the last 5 years, where I would have been brought in at a senior level. And that's what it was. It was do one of these presentations as though you're presenting to the CEO. My feedback, which I've spoken about before, was you seem like you literally have never done this before.
Oh, no.
Because I absolutely hadn't. I was like, I don't know. This is what I pitched to the CEO. And by the way, they were like, that was the idea that ended up winning. But
That's awesome.
You have no idea what would be required in that deck. And I was like, yeah, I put together 5 slides. I don't know. With a smiley face.
Well, it's a good way to see, like, not just for the interviewer, but for the interviewee. Like, do I like answering this kind of question? Do I get excited by this? So yeah.
Well, that's something that when we interviewed one of my best friends, also engineer, I have such a soft spot for the engineers. One of my good friends, Jane, who also was HBS, went to McKinsey. She was in the Boston office, but she was saying that one of the things that she loved about the consulting interviews is that what they're asking you to do is literally what you do for your job. So if you like the interview process, then it's a good sign. You'll probably like the work. If you don't like the interview process, then this is probably not the right job for you.
Yeah. It's how do you think about like the ambiguity and not having all the information you might want at the time? All of that comes into play in the interview and then gets magnified in real life. So
So I'm curious, Florence, so you spoke about the role of the Inroads program as being kind of that very first stepping stone for you. That's the only time in the context of any of these conversations that we've been having over the last checks clock, 36 minutes, that you've mentioned that was specifically designed to bring underrepresented minorities into the industry. Can you talk about what that meant to you and what your experience has been like in terms of being an underrepresented minority, and as much detail or as little detail as you are kind of comfortable talking about what role that has played in your working experience?
Yeah, I mean, I'll always sing Inroads praises because I think it gave me that first opportunity to get like a real paycheck. Like I was actually, I hope my mom doesn't mind me saying this, I was making more as an intern than she was as my mother that first summer. I was 19. And
over the whole summer versus her annual?
No, sorry. Like if I annualized, my mom works very hard. She's a dietitian for the VA. But yeah, I was like, it was kind of like, oh my gosh, like this is already changing the course of my life. And so Inroads provided me not just the job, but also there was like all of this training stuff that, some other people might learn from their parents or like seeing other role models, but like training, like, how do you write a professional email? How do you go to a business dinner and like feel comfortable? Like things that
I know that Harvard didn't teach you that because Harvard's useless.
Yeah, they didn't. They might now, like, because it's all very practical, and that might exist now. And maybe it existed for folks who knew they were going into business, but as an engineer, like that was not like what we were like even thinking about. I credit Inroads for a lot of like that more professional development early on. And then I would say through my career, I've been super lucky to have mentors. Like I think one thing, so I'm Black. My father's Cameroonian, my mother's white, but I self-identify as Black. And one thing that I've noticed for my whole career is just the number of people who will reach their hand to you and say like, I'm going to help you. Whether it was practicing case interviews is my senior year of college, so I could get that Deloitte internship. Like I remember my friend Lawrence, he had a job at McKinsey and he was like, Flo, how are you doing on these interviews? I'm going to help you. I'm going to practice with you.
Does Lawrence self-identify as Black as well?
He is. He's Nigerian American, and he's amazing.
So that was my question. Like,
sorry, yeah.
I mean, no. It's important to clarify because, like, I can totally see everyone being like, "Dude, I want to help this girl succeed. Like, she's awesome. Like, irrespective of race." So I do think it's important just to note that it was like, "Hey, listen, people who had come ahead of you who also felt they were from a similar background, even if not exactly the same circumstances, were like, oh, I got to make sure that I help you come along." Just the same way. It's funny. We talked about this in a podcast with the CEO of a private wealth management firm. He's like, I'm from Maine. So when I meet people from Maine, I like am predisposed to I'm predisposed to like them because that's just me being human. Like it's silly, but that's a much bigger thing than just being from Maine.
Well, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's people who have common experiences. They can be like, this is something that I encountered and this is how I dealt with it, or whatever it is, like whatever the experience. That's how I do think humans like tend to relate to each other is commonalities. So that makes complete sense. Jen,
and so you were talking about the role of mentors. Sorry, I cut you off when you were talking about Lawrence.
Yeah. So, I mean, not all of my mentors look like me or are female or male. Like I've just been really lucky, but I would say that the Black community has been incredibly supportive of me throughout my whole career. I remember at Deloitte, my first mentor was Ilya Gerdes. He's mixed like me. And we were paired up. He was like manager level. I was an analyst. He wound up staffing me a couple of times on some of my best projects. He connected me with the chief strategy officer at Deloitte and I worked on a project with him. Like he was always looking out for me, and then felt the same thing at McKinsey. We have the McKinsey Black Network, which is this phenomenal organization. They provide additional training before you start. You have a buddy when you come in. Actually skipped my HBS graduation to go to their McKinsey Black Network retreat in Johannesburg. I was like, I definitely want to go to South Africa. So sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, Mom, I'm skipping my graduation. But I would say throughout my career, anytime you ask for help or even when you don't, people have always been willing to help. And even coming into Bain Capital, I got the first call and I was like, okay, do I know anybody at Bain Capital? And there were two names, one woman who I'd gone to college with, and then another guy who was my last client when I was at McKinsey. So I kind of knew him from that, like just seeing him around the office. And I reached out to both of them and they were like, yeah, let's get on the phone. Let's talk about this. And so I think just being able to know that people are going to look out for you and support you, I think that's been like a very common theme in my career. It's like knowing that sometimes you might have to be the first, but you don't have to always be the only. And there's always going to be people looking out for you. It's really exciting. And it's something I try to take forward.
You might be the first, but you don't always have to be the only. I love that perspective. Mm-hmm. Have you felt uncomfortable being the only when you are the only? Or have you been like, I'm just waiting so I can reach my hand back behind me and pull someone else up? Like, what does it actually feel like? I've never been the only of anything wherever I've gone in my life. I don't know what it's like to be the only.
I would say, honestly, more often than not, it's the latter. It's more like I'm excited to help the next person. Definitely in my career, I have felt that. I mean, in a lot of client situations, at Chevron, I was the only like Black woman engineer in my group at the refinery. But that happens a lot when you're a Black female in business or a Black female in STEM. But I would say I've always just been motivated to see like, okay, how can I help? Like when I was at HBS, I was our career rep for my section. Like I love helping people think about their careers and like opening those doors for other people. And so it's not always easy to be the only, but it's not something I focus on as much as more like I feel incredibly lucky to be where I am. Mm-hmm. And I also acknowledge how much help I have. One of my mentors and people I work most closely with, she's a woman in business and she's been paving this path. Yeah, I feel really lucky for all of the people who've like kind of reached their hands out for me.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because obviously my experience is so different because I mean, I'm a woman, but that's about it. But like, I will say being a woman in engineering, especially on the mechanical side and like material science, there's that even alone is like, there is two of us who were mechanical engineering women who graduated my year at Brown. you're a minority as a woman, but then you also are Black. I'm curious if you ever saw it this way. I always liked being different. I actually switched my major from biomedical to mechanical engineering because I wanted to go where there were fewer women, which is like kind of strange. But I actually just, not that like it really meant anything, but I enjoyed standing out and being different. I don't know if you have a similar perspective or if it's like not at all. I mean, I think the nice thing is that the more people who are behind us see, you know what I mean? Like it paves the way to just see someone who looks like you in another role. But I'm curious if it was something that like you actually thought, I don't want to say helps you at all, because that's the wrong word, but just like if it was something that you took pride in. Like, look, I mean, I am doing this thing, I am kicking ass, and I mean, watch me kick ass. I don't know. Like, does that kind of make sense?
Yeah, no, I definitely have felt that at times. I think some days it's harder when you get a little bit more of the imposter syndrome, but like most days it's like, look, I can do really tough things like graduate with a degree in engineering from an Ivy League school. Like that's really freaking hard.
Hey, not just a Ivy League, it's Harvard. I mean, as like the sad brown, I mean, it's again, like not to, but it is one of these things where, you know, on the Wall Street Oasis board, so like Brown is like a fake Ivy, you know, so, but no, I mean, like you are clearly so smart. Ivy League grad, engineering, McKinsey, like, I mean, Bain Capital, it's like all these things. And just talking to you, you're just so incredibly accomplished. It's just, it's really, yeah.
No, there is some power in it in sort of like paving a path or being one of few. I will say a shout out to Doug. He was my mentor at Deloitte, who also did engineering at Brown. So
I also noticed that you've mentioned a lot of male mentors. It's something that we talked about in another podcast episode, which was, you know, does Wall Street kind of have a woman problem, which is the experience that I had certainly, and for different reasons than Kristen, which is I didn't have a ton of great female mentors. And
I just didn't have any females.
She didn't have any.
Yeah.
Mine were the female mentors I had. Not all of them, but many of them were less than model managers. And I wanted to actually touch on that podcast episode for a reason. We were sitting there having a conversation on video like this with a woman named Carissa Jordan, who's also white. We just released another episode with her last weekend. And the number of comments we got aimed at her that said DEI hire were overwhelming. The number of people we had to block on social media. First of all, like, we're all old AF, okay? Like, we were all hired before any DEI programming was in place, pretty much. But the idea that her accomplishments could be dismissed as, oh, you were only hired because of this. I hope that we don't get any of that vitriol directed at us, and we will immediately block it and shut it down having this conversation. But I always, like, live with the knowledge that those awful people are out there who think this way. Have you ever had that? You talked about your imposter syndrome. There's not a single accomplishment you have that anyone can take away from you. Have you ever had that critique leveled at you by people who don't know their ass from their elbow, saying, oh, you're just a DEI hire, you're only here because of whatever? Again, Harvard Business School, like, I mean, talk about the number of flexes you have. It's ridiculous. But I'm curious, have you ever gotten that thrown your way?
Not recently, but actually people close to me who I love, I have gotten that around, like, oh, well, you got into Harvard because you're Black, right? And it's like, no. Let me correct you.
I will actually say, Florence,
like
I think it's really interesting that it was people close to you who said that, as opposed to trolls that you don't know. Because I will say that the most hurtful, like the comments that we get from trolls don't actually hurt us, because they're like, you're a bot, we don't care, like, go away, right? Like, user 1287654, no one cares about you. You made one post ever, and you're going to delete this account immediately. But when it's the people close to you, I actually think they can sometimes say the most hurtful things, because they're jealous of your success.
I was going to say, because they're jealous. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it has nothing to do, but I think that they weaponize something like that. And I hope that you took it that way, as they're jealous of you. Because whenever we've gotten something hurtful said to us, it's only been from jealousy.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just even in these instances, it's like a misunderstanding of what it took to get to where I've gotten. And I'm like, I'll be happy to tell them. And I have told them, or my mom will jump in. Like my mom is like, yeah. So I stuck up for myself. I would say it does, because there is that kind of attitude that I know exists. It is something where you just feel like you have to work that much harder, be that much more excellent, and just like never have it even be a question because you're doing all the right things in terms of the kind of work you're doing and
But you feel like you can never rest on your laurels for like a second.
Never.
That you
No,
have to,
you can't.
Yeah.
And like I wouldn't want to. Like you want to keep,
Oh, I
you
can
want to
tell.
keep striving. Yeah.
You're like, I got a call and I just had twins. And I was like, you know what I mean? The amount of, a lot of our listeners have not necessarily had kids before. Jen and I are both parents. Neither of us have ever had twins. Twins is just, I mean, so the idea that you were going through recruiting, by the way, in 2020, where I'm assuming there was also less childcare help because people didn't want to have childcare with newborns who are like, their immune systems are obviously highly compromised because they don't have an immune system yet.
Yeah.
So that alone just shows your tenacity, like being like, yeah, I just had twins, but I'm going to do this recruiting thing for Bain Capital. So
now the other question I have for you is when you have something like Harvard on your resume, that's also a category killer. You know what I'm saying? That is going to open so many doors for whoever you are. I was like a crappy English major from Princeton, and people were like, would you like a job here? Would you like a job here? Right? Like, because it said Princeton, not because I had demonstrated some lights out ability to do anything, because that does open doors. What about for if there were a Florence who were exactly like you, but going to a total non-target school that no one's ever heard of? What advice would you give to her as far as trying to get to where you are now? What does her path look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say just continue to work hard, be the top of your class at what if you're at a non-target school, like be the top of your class, put yourself in positions, like join those kind of, if you have access to them, like if there's like an SEO or something like that, which will put you in position to even have access to different careers that might only focus on target schools. And then if you're interested in grad school, like get into the best grad school you can and like use that as a stepping stone. Like I applied to McKinsey 3 times. Like I left that out of the story, but I applied twice in undergrad. I applied twice in undergrad, and then
well, that's just like Jane said the same thing. She's like, I applied when I was an undergrad, and she's like, they gave me a balance sheet and I froze, and then I applied again when I was at HBS, and she got the job. Like I think that it's one of these things that I do think it's important for people to like hear that you can try something and you may not succeed the first time. Like I'm very open. I applied to all the banks my senior year and I got rejected every single place I applied. They were like, yeah, no. So I do think people need to hear that like you can go through a round of recruiting and not make it. And by the way, that doesn't mean that you are not qualified. It doesn't mean that you're not going to get the job that you want. Persistence and hard work. And if you keep going for it, then there's very good chance that you will come out and succeed. But you have to keep going for the thing that you want.
Absolutely. Yeah, that persistence. And just because you're at a non-target school doesn't mean you can't find an amazing career path. You have to maybe edge yourself out in a different way and work a little bit differently than somebody else.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And I really love that theme of the road to success is paved with so many rejections. And no one talks about the rejections after the fact unless you make the rejections your whole persona. So it's up to you whether you let that define. I mean, Kristen has shared this story, but it's not like we open every podcast with like, and now we're joined by Kristen Kelly, the thrice rejected investment banking hopeful from 2005. No, right? And these firms, it's not like they dismiss your application with prejudice. It's not like you go into the reject bin.
I might have actually at Morgan Stanley investment banking after not knowing who Alan Greenspan was. I'm pretty sure I actually
You made it into that division anyway.
I did eventually. Yes.
They couldn't keep you out. I always say, like, everyone aspires to be the GOAT. And I got this from someone else. This is not my line at all. But I aspire to be the cockroach. Like, you can't kill me, okay? Like, I'm surviving the nuclear winter and the age of the dinosaurs and the asteroid hitting the Earth. I'm going to be around, okay? So I'm a cockroach. I'd rather be the cockroach than the GOAT.
That's a good quote, Jen. I like that. That's a good one. We'll add that to our list. Like, good quotes. That and Cringe Mountain. The road to success is over the other side of Cringe Mountain.
Oh, God. Yeah. Florence, let me tell you, being on social media, it's not for the faint of heart. Okay. Talking about having to stare rejection in the face on a daily basis. Oh my God. Well, this has been awesome. Any parting words of wisdom or anything we didn't cover that you want to share with our listeners?
No, I mean, I think this was a really wonderful conversation. I loved all the questions. I would say, yeah, I think when it comes to your career or just anything that you're going after, I love this theme of persistence and just keep trying. If one door closes, there you find another one, find a window, like figure it out and figure out the resources and don't be afraid to ask for help. I think that's what I would leave folks with.
Well, thank you so much. This has been amazing, Florence. So thank you so much for coming on, and we look forward to many conversations in the future.
Same here.
Congrats
This was
on
a
all your
blast.
success, Florence.
Oh, thank you.
Seriously.